In 10 days, Ukraine hit 136 ships, not warships, not a single cruiser or corvette among them. They were tankers, old, rusting, anonymous oil tankers, the kind that never make the news, riding low in the water, under flags of countries they have never visited. And that is exactly why this matters. Because after years of hunting Russia's navy, Ukraine has quietly shifted its aim to a target that bleeds the Kremlin far more than any warship ever could. It has started sinking the money. This is the story of how the war at sea turned into a war on Russia's oil, how a shallow, forgotten sea became the opening battlefield, and why every burning tanker is a strike not against Russia's military, but against the bank account that pays for the entire war. Let's start with the target, because to understand why this campaign is so dangerous for Moscow, you have to understand what a shadow fleet actually is. When Western countries sanctioned Russian oil and set a price cap designed to choke the Kremlin's most important source of income, Russia did not stop selling oil. It went underground. It assembled a fleet of hundreds of aging tankers, bought quietly through shell companies, registered in obscure jurisdictions, insured by no one anyone can trace, and operated in the dark, literally. These ships switch off their transponders so they cannot be tracked. They transfer oil from vessel to vessel in the open sea to hide where it came from. They sail under flags of convenience from tiny nations that ask no questions. This is the shadow fleet, and it is the single most important tool Russia uses to keep its oil money flowing, despite every sanction the West has thrown at it. To understand the scale of what Russia built, consider the numbers. This is not a handful of ships. Analysts estimate the shadow fleet at hundreds of tankers. By some counts, well over 1,000 vessels worldwide are now involved in moving sanctioned oil, a huge share of them carrying Russian crude. These are old ships, often decades old, near the end of their working lives, bought cheaply and sailed hard, because no one expects them to last. Their real job is not to be safe or efficient. Their job is to be deniable. When Western nations imposed a price cap, a rule that Russian oil could only be legally shipped and insured if it sold below a set price, around $60 a barrel, the entire point was to force Russia to either sell cheap or not sell at all. The shadow fleet is how Russia said no. By moving oil outside the reach of Western insurers and Western rules, Russia can sell above the cap to buyers who do not care about the paperwork and keep the full price for itself. The shadow fleet is not a smuggling sideshow. It is the main way a sanctioned petrostate keeps its economy alive. And that money is enormous. Oil and gas exports are the financial engine of the Russian state, the revenue that pays for soldiers, for missiles, for drones, for the entire war machine grinding away against Ukraine. Every barrel that slips out through the shadow fleet and reaches a buyer turns back into cash, and that cash turns into more war. So when Ukraine looked at the map and asked where it could hurt Russia the most, the answer was not another warship sitting in a harbor. It was the tankers. Take out the tankers, and you do not just disable a ship, you destroy the thing that funds everything else. But Ukraine did not begin in the open ocean. It began in a place most people have never thought about as a battlefield, the Sea of Azov. Look at a map, and the Azov is easy to miss. A small, shallow inland sea tucked into the northeast corner of the Black Sea, connected to it only through the narrow Kerch Strait. It is one of the shallowest seas on Earth, in many places just a few meters deep. Before the full-scale invasion, it was shared water. After 2022, with Russia occupying Mariupol, Berdyansk, and the entire northern coast, Moscow treated the Azov as a private lake, a safe, sheltered highway for moving fuel, cargo, and military supplies to occupied Crimea and to the southern front. It felt untouchable. It was close to Russian territory, far from the open sea, and shielded by the Kerch Strait. For Russia, the Azov was the soft, protected back room where the logistics of the occupation quietly moved back and forth. There is history buried in that water too. The Azov has been a flashpoint before. Back in 2018, years before the full-scale invasion, Russia built the Kerch Bridge across the strait and then used it as a gate, physically blocking and harassing Ukrainian shipping trying to reach the ports of Mariupol and Berdyansk, even seizing Ukrainian naval vessels and their crews in open water. It was a preview of everything to come, Russia using control of that narrow strait to strangle Ukrainian trade and project power over a sea it did not own. Then came 2022, and the siege of Mariupol, one of the most brutal chapters of the entire war, ended with Russia holding the whole northern Azov coast. From that point on, the sea was effectively closed. Russian ships moved through it freely, supplying the occupation, while Ukraine had no way to reach it by conventional means at all. For 3 years, the Azov was the one piece of water where Russia could feel completely secure. And that is exactly why Ukraine went there first. In early July, Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces launched a multi-day operation across the Sea of Azov, a sustained, rolling campaign against the Shadow Fleet ships and support vessels moving through that water. Over roughly a week, Ukraine says its drones struck around 116 vessels in the Azov alone. Read that number again. Not one, not a dozen, over 100 ships hit in a single sea in a matter of days. Whatever the precise damage on each one, the message was unmistakable. The safe backroom was not safe anymore. The sheltered Russian lake had become a shooting gallery, and the tankers and barges that Russia relied on to keep Crimea and the southern front supplied were suddenly burning in water Moscow thought it owned completely. And there was a precise logic to which ships they were hunting. The commander of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, known by the call sign Madyar, laid it out plainly. The goal in the Azov was to paralyze Russia's feeder fleet. Those are the small and medium tankers, flat-bottomed vessels around 140 meters long, each carrying only a few thousand tons, that are built specifically to work shallow water. They are the first link in the export chain. Big ocean-going tankers cannot reach the shallow terminals and canals of the Azov region, so Russia uses these little feeder ships to shuttle oil out, down the Volga-Don Canal and across the Azov, to where the large tankers wait in deeper water to carry it to the world. Cripple the feeders, and the oil never reaches the big tankers at all. The whole export machine jams at its very first step, and the same shallow water shuttles that move oil out also move fuel in. Gasoline and diesel, ferried across the Azov to keep occupied Crimea running. Hit them, and you choke both directions at once, the oil going out to be sold, and the fuel coming in to supply the occupation. By Ukraine's own tally, it was a rout, a scoreline of dozens to nothing, night after night. This is what logistics warfare actually looks like. It is not glamorous. There are no dramatic duels between great warships. It is the patient, relentless destruction of the boring, essential things, the fuel barges, the cargo ships, the tankers, that an army needs to keep fighting. Cut the logistics, and the most powerful military in the world grinds to a halt, because tanks without fuel are just steel, and an occupation without supply lines is a countdown. Ukraine had already spent years proving this on land and against Russia's warships. Now it was doing it to the oil trade itself. Then the campaign did something that should worry the Kremlin even more. It left the Azov and followed the oil into the open Black Sea. On a single night in mid-July, Ukrainian drones struck 20 more vessels, this time in the Black Sea, near occupied Crimea. And the breakdown of those 20 tells the whole story of what this campaign is really about. 17 of them were oil tankers. 2 were gas tankers. 1 was a tugboat, not warships, not troop transports. Tankers, the floating wallets of the Russian war economy, hit one after another in a single night. It was the opening of a new phase. The war on the Shadow Fleet was no longer confined to the shallow, protected Azov. It had moved out into the main sea, into the deep water where Russia's oil actually reaches the world. Add it all together and the scale becomes staggering. Across both seas, in roughly 10 days, Ukraine says it hit 136 Shadow Fleet vessels. 136, in 10 days, against a fleet built specifically to be invisible, to slip through sanctions unnoticed. Ukraine had found it and started taking it apart, ship by ship. So how do you hit 136 ships in 10 days? Not with a navy. Ukraine barely has one. And here is the part that surprises most people. For this campaign, the main weapon was not the famous sea drones that once sank Russia's warships. It was the flying kind, small, cheap FPV attack drones, the same first-person view quadcopters that have come to define this war on land, now sent out over the water in swarms. Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, The drone units, built around commanders like the one known as Madyar, whose operators fly under the nickname Madyar's birds, launch them by the dozen against the tankers, night after night. A single pilot, watching through the drone's camera, flies it straight at a ship and puts the warhead exactly where he wants it. No boats, no crews at sea, no risk to a single Ukrainian life. Just a swarm of flying cameras with explosives strapped to them, picking apart a fleet in the dark. And there is something genuinely clever in how they used them, because the goal was not to sink these tankers. Think about where most of this was happening. The Sea of Azov is shallow and enclosed, and a tanker full of oil torn open and sent to the bottom would not be a victory. It would be an environmental catastrophe, an oil spill poisoning a sea that Ukraine fully intends to get back. So instead of trying to breach the hull below the waterline, the drone pilots aimed for the parts that make a ship, the bridge, the engines, the navigation and radar, the pumps and the controls. The point was not to sink the tanker, but to cripple it, to leave it floating, intact, but blind, dead in the water, and useless. A ship that cannot navigate, cannot pump, and cannot move is worthless to the oil trade, even if it never goes under. Ukraine even confirmed in some cases that a struck tanker was carrying no oil at the time, precisely to avoid a spill. It is a strangely surgical kind of destruction, wrecking the machine while leaving the hull whole and the sea clean, taking the ship out of the game without turning a strike into a disaster. Every one of these machines costs a tiny fraction of the ship it destroys, and none of them risks a single Ukrainian life. That is the arithmetic that has defined this entire war at sea. And against the Shadow Fleet, it is even more lopsided than before. Because a tanker is not just expensive to replace, it is nearly impossible to replace quietly. Russia built its Shadow Fleet in the shadows precisely because it cannot simply walk into the open market and buy new tankers without exposing the whole sanctions-dodging operation. Every hull Ukraine destroys is a hull that took months of secret dealing to acquire and cannot be easily replaced. Now think about what this does to Russia beyond the ships themselves, because the real damage is not the steel, it is the fear. The Shadow Fleet works only if the ships keep sailing. The moment those tankers become targets, the moment owners and crews and the shadowy middlemen who move this oil start to believe that loading Russian crude near Crimea means their vessel might be torn apart by a drone in the night, the entire system starts to seize up. Insurance, already almost impossible for these ships, becomes unthinkable. Crews demand more money or refuse to sail. Buyers hesitate. Every tanker that Ukraine hits does not just remove one ship from the trade. It raises the cost, the risk, and the fear for every other ship still out there. A weapon that costs a few $100,000 can make a multi-billion-dollar smuggling operation too dangerous to run. That is the true target of this campaign, not the tankers, but the confidence that keeps the oil moving. There is a hard financial mechanism underneath all of this. Shipping runs on insurance, and insurance runs on risk. The moment a route becomes a war zone, the premiums to sail it climb, sometimes to the point where a single voyage costs a fortune before a drop of oil is even sold. Russia's Shadow Fleet already operates on the margins, using ghost insurers and self-declared coverage, precisely because the real market will not touch it. Now add the genuine, demonstrated risk of being blown apart by a drone, and the economics start to invert. The whole reason the Shadow Fleet exists is to make sanctioned oil profitable despite the obstacles. But if the losses mount, if ship after ship is left crippled and burning, if every voyage carries a real chance of ending in wreckage, then at some point, the numbers stop working. The oil that was supposed to fund the war starts costing more to move than it earns. That is the quiet victory Ukraine is chasing. Not sinking every tanker, which is impossible, but making the entire trade so expensive and so dangerous that it stops paying for itself. And this is where the strategy connects to everything Ukraine has been doing at sea. First, it broke Russia's Black Sea Fleet, driving the warships back into their harbors. Then it went after the bridge and the bases and the refineries that fuel the war. Now it is going after the tankers that pay for it. It is the same idea, applied one layer deeper each time. Do not try to match Russia gun for gun and ship for ship. You will lose that fight. Instead, find the thing the enemy cannot afford to lose. The thing that is expensive, slow to replace, and impossible to fully protect. And destroy it with something cheap and endless. warships, bridges, refineries, and now the floating tankers that turn Russian oil into war money. And there is a second target sitting behind the oil money: Crimea itself. The occupied peninsula is the beating heart of Russia's entire southern operation. The bases, the airfields, the supply depots that feed the war in the south all run through it. For years, its lifeline was the Kerch Bridge, but that bridge has been struck and damaged repeatedly, and Russia no longer trusts it to carry everything. So more and more of what Crimea needs, fuel above all, comes by sea, across the Azov, and through the strait, on exactly the kind of tankers and barges Ukraine is now hunting. Choke that traffic, and you are not just cutting Russia's oil revenue, you are slowly starving the occupation of the fuel it runs on. The campaign against the Shadow Fleet and the campaign to isolate Crimea are, in the end, the same campaign. Every tanker that burns in the Azov is a tanker that is not delivering diesel to a Russian base on the peninsula. The Kerch Strait sits at the center of all of it, the narrow neck of water between the Azov and the Black Sea, the choke point every one of these ships must pass through to move between the two seas. It is the door between Russia's protected backroom and the open ocean, and it is exactly the kind of narrow, crowded, contested water where cheap drones are most deadly. Controlling who can safely pass through that strait means controlling the logistics of the entire southern theater. The fuel, the cargo, the oil, all of it funneled through one vulnerable gap. And Ukraine has made it clear that gap is no longer safe. Step back and you can see the shape of a new kind of war. For most of history, a naval blockade meant a wall of warships physically stopping other ships from passing. An expensive, dangerous, manpower-heavy operation that only a great naval power could sustain. Britain blockaded Germany in the First World War with the largest navy on Earth, a ring of steel that took years and enormous resources to hold. A blockade was, by definition, something only the strong could do, because it meant putting your own ships in harm's way for months on end and daring the enemy to break through. It was the ultimate expression of naval dominance. Ukraine has inverted that completely. It has built a blockade with no fleet at all. It does not need to stop and board every tanker. It just needs to make the water dangerous enough that the tankers stop coming, or pay so much in risk and insurance and losses that the oil trade bleeds money instead of making it. A blockade made of cheap drones and fear, enforced by a country that a few years ago scuttled its own flagship to keep it out of enemy hands. And the target it has chosen, the Shadow Fleet, is not just Russia's problem. That same fleet of dark, untraceable, uninsured tankers is a growing danger to the entire world. Aging ships with no accountability sailing through crowded waters, one accident away from an environmental disaster, funneling sanctioned oil to buyers who look the other way. Ukraine's campaign is doing something that years of Western sanctions and price caps struggled to do. It is making the Shadow Fleet visibly, physically dangerous to operate. Every navy and every government watching the sanctions fight is now seeing an answer they had not fully considered, that the way to enforce a blockade on a fleet you cannot legally stop might not be paperwork and port inspections at all. It might be a swarm of cheap drones and the simple, brutal message that this cargo is not worth the risk. Russia will keep trying to move its oil. It has too much riding on it to stop. The Shadow Fleet is the artery that funds the war, and cutting it off completely is not something 136 strikes in 10 days can finish. The tankers will keep sailing, under new names, under new flags, taking new routes, hugging safer coasts. But they will sail more slowly, more expensively, and more afraid. The Azov is no longer a safe lake. The Black Sea is no longer a safe route. And the quiet, invisible business of turning Russian oil into war money now has to run through water where, at any moment, out of the dark, something cheap and crewless might come screaming down out of the sky toward the deck. Ukraine spent years learning that it could not beat Russia by matching its firepower. So it stopped trying. It went after the warships, then the bridges, then the refineries, and now the money itself, the tankers, the oil, the revenue that makes the whole war possible. A country with almost no navy has turned two seas into a trap for the fleet that funds an empire, and every burning tanker sends the same message that these little drones have been sending since the very beginning. It does not matter how big and expensive you are, if the thing hunting you is cheap, patient, and everywhere. Thanks for watching. If you want to